You're listening to American Medicine Today, presented by the Bonati Spine Institute, featuring internationally acclaimed inventor of the Bonati spine procedures, Alfred Bonati, MD. Once again, your host, Kimberly Bermel Bonati, and co-host Ethan Euchre and Jeff Wagstaff.
I am Kimberly Bermel Bonati, alongside our great friend Ethan Euchre.
I thought you forgot my name for a minute.
No, I know your name, EY.
You gotta know
and
my
then
name.
we also have Jeff Wagstaff, our senior fellow.
Hello.
Hello,
Yes.
Jeffrey.
And we've been discussing all day long during commercial breaks about this particular topic. And there's a new sex abuse law in New York, and it's causing obsessive-compulsive disorder hotlines to be flooded with calls from people suffering from something called predator OCD.
Never heard of it until now.
Me either.
Right.
It was an interesting read.
Yeah.
Joining us to discuss what exactly that means is Dr. Stephen Brodsky, an OCD and trauma specialist who has appeared on NBC Nightly News and The Today Show and has been featured in the New York Times as well as the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Brodsky.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Well, before we get into predator OCD, and like I told you during break, it's a new concept, a new term to everybody in this room and probably everyone listening and or watching. Before we have you describe what that is, why don't you just tell us what standard OCD is and how it affects people?
Sure, be happy to. Let me start off actually by saying what it's not, because of a lot of misconceptions. First of all, I think it's important for everyone to know that OCD is an extremely common anxiety condition shared by millions of people, and it's extremely treatable. So there's a lot of hope for people who might be listening to this show or finding it online, for themselves personally. OCD, it's considered it's an anxiety disorder. It's basically a fancy word for fear. We all know people who are afraid of all kinds of things, dogs, flying, what have you. And we all know what they need to do to overcome it. They have to gradually, in small doses, attempt to, spend more time doing that. OCD is no different. Now, we know, though, that if a person avoids something that they're afraid of, it really doesn't matter what it is, the fear always gets worse. OCD is exactly the same thing. The only difference is that instead of my being afraid of a dog or flying or a new job, let's say, I'm afraid of a mere thought in my head. We all have thoughts that pop into our heads every day, even people without OCD. But for some reason, people with OCD have zero tolerance for thoughts that are bothering and disturbing.
Right.
And they just have to fight it like crazy, or avoid anything at all that's going to remind them of it, or any kind of feared situation. So basically, the thought that a person has that's disturbing to them, let's say something bad will happen to me, for example, that would be called an obsession. And everything I do to try to get rid of thinking about that is called a compulsion. That could be, avoiding certain situations or people that I associate with being harmful. The problem is that it doesn't really work, because, like all other fears, I'm doing that to avoid a thought.
Right.
And, you can't just, it's sort of like, I can't stop thinking about a white elephant if I'm told not to think about it. That's basically what's happening with OCD, is that the very thing that the person thinks is the way of dealing with the problem is actually the cause of the problem, and it just becomes a vicious cycle.
So how do you go about treating that? Because that's what you specialize in, correct? Is it medication? Is it therapy? What exactly do you do to treat that?
Well, another good thing for people to know is that very often, first of all, it's extremely treatable. There's highly effective therapy for it. And very often medication is not necessary at all. Sometimes if it is, though, it is possible very often to get off the medicine before the end of therapy. It's based on very common sense principles. Like we were saying before, if you keep avoiding something entirely, your fear will just increase. It's very hard to avoid our own thoughts. I could avoid, again, flying in an airplane. I can't avoid my own thoughts.
Okay.
So you would think, let's get rid of the thought, then we won't have any problem. But again, then we're back to the don't think about a white elephant paradox. We actually have to stop the person gradually from either avoiding something that makes them uncomfortable or or prevent them from doing something that they do to somehow, in their mind, prove to themselves that nothing wrong is going to happen. And we do that in a very graduated way, starting with something extremely simple, and then gradually, the client and the therapist would talk over some various things that the client would feel comfortable doing as like next sort of baby steps. And gradually, in a matter of months rather than years, you start to see some really significant changes in people. It's really very gratifying to watch.
And how is that sex abuse law in New York City really causing these people to call in and think that they have predator OCD?
Yeah, what exactly is that? Explain that to us.
Right. So let me just say OCD, the calls that I get about OCD very much mirror whatever happens to be in the news at that time. If there's an epidemic, people worry they get the epidemic, and I get calls about that. If, in this case, the news is full of all these terrible stories, and this new law, and in any case, full of terrible stories, and I get lots of calls of people wondering, gee, they suddenly have this absurd thought that pops into their head. Wait a second. I remember when I was, 10 years old, I was playing with a friend, and gee, I wondered, did I do something inappropriate? Or gee, somebody I cared about was playing with me, and did they do something inappropriate? And their imagination just goes wild. Now, so I get a lot of calls about that. Now, what's really escalated is that because of the rising consciousness of all this and the Me Too movement and everything, there have been new legal reforms. It used to be that you could only make a case against someone for statute of limitations of 7 years. They've now, many states have now made an act for a temporary period of time, maybe a year, in which you can go back decades, 30 years, 40 years, and so forth, which suddenly has reopened literally thousands of charges and cases against just every conceivable institution in society. And so now these people who are calling, they're either wondering, gee, was I a predator? Did I do something inappropriate? Or did that happen to me?
Right.
They're usually like reviewing their lives over and over and over again, but to try to solve that question, never getting resolution. And now with this new law, they're even more terrified. Oh, my God, what if, I have to think back even further in my lifetime, 30, 50 years. Right. Did I ever do anything?
How are people supposed to remember something that happened 30 to 50 years ago? And I mean, I get that we're talking about someone who has OCD, so they have a thought process disorder, basically.
Right.
But
Right.
How do you treat somebody like that? And to me, it almost sounds like, as you were explaining what it is, it almost sounds like a form of hypochondria. You know what I mean? Like you hear about something.
Actually is a type of OCD.
Oh, really?
Makes sense.
Yeah, hypochondria. There are actually, one thing I'd like to impress upon people is that there are literally hundreds of different types of OCD, many of which have nothing to do with what you see in movies and books, hand washing, lock checking, things like that, or keeping things neat, has nothing to do with that. So someone with hypochondria is always thinking, all of a sudden they read about someone, they hear about someone getting sick, they read about an epidemic, they start to wonder, I noticed some sensation in my body. They become hypersensitive, and maybe that means that I'm catching that illness.
Right.
Well, similarly with this, now the key thing here, what really makes it OCD and so frustrating is that the person knows rationally that it's false, but they cannot stop thinking about it nevertheless. So that's why they call it compulsive. It's as if the person is thinking this even against their own rational free will, trying to prove to them, trying for them to try to remember what happened. Really pointless, actually. And unfortunately, many therapists are actually perpetuating the problem by trying to convince their clients that either nothing ever happened, they didn't do anything to anyone else, no one did anything to them, etc., and it goes nowhere. So very frequently, people who come to me have seen multiple therapists before. So it's not a matter of convincing them. It's that these are thoughts that, as disturbing as they are, in truth, everybody will have these kinds of really crazy thoughts flit through our mind now and then. We'll hear something on the news, we'll wonder, oh my God, that's terrible, what if that happened to me, what if I did that to someone else? But most people, it just kind of like fizzles out. They don't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. Someone with OCD, when they hear this, whatever their pet worry is, they go into it's like a life and death fight.
Fight or flight.
They cannot look at themselves in the mirror if they think that this is something they could have done or could have happened to them. And what keeps it alive is that their compulsion is, so one is, like I said, reviewing their whole lifetime. They may ask for reassurance from other people. If I were a pedophile, would I, like, for example, if I think a kid is cute, does that mean I'm a pedophile? Even if I never did anything? Or, I don't know, if a teacher, patted me on the shoulder, is it possible that I wasn't aware at the time that they actually did something worse than that? Or very often, if it involves, adults, sometimes, you go on a date or you're at a social gathering, you may have some alcohol, you may get a little drunk and forget what happened. You can wake up and wonder, oh my God, wait a second. Did I do something? Did someone do something to me?
Right.
And it just never ends.
It does happen. Well, Dr. Brodsky, we're basically out of time, but I was checking out your website, and you have actually like a survey of questions that people can ask themselves if they have OCD, and you also offer up free advice on your website. So how can people get in touch with you if they have questions or would even like treatment? You're based out of New York, of course, but...
Yeah, anytime. I don't care where you are in the world. My website is ocdhotline.com, and you can email me. If you're within I will email something back to you within 24 hours. If you happen to be, in the Northeast or New York, New Jersey, Connecticut area, of course, I'd be happy to call you back within that period of time.
Okay, perfect.
Obviously, I don't have a whole switchwood to deal with an entire world calling me, but
sure.
But it's as simple as that. They can contact me. I will respond to their questions. Their questions are completely confidential. I'm the only one who will ever see them.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Brodsky, an OCD and trauma specialist. Thank you for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
OCDhotline.com. Interesting stuff.
Well, make sure you stay tuned. Coming up after the break, a socialist cesspool.
Socialist cesspool.
You're listening to American Medicine Today.